Ladies and gentlemen, let's kick off our second panel. Matthew, the panel is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be back in Warsaw with such an illustrious panel, and I think Slavomir has come up with a very sort of provocative title for this discussion: the United States, a European power or a power in Europe. And this is a question I've been asking myself a lot recently, and I think you can read different things into that title. What I read into it is whether the United States is going to remain in Europe basically forever, if we are going to be sort of part of the furniture here, or if we are going to be influencing European politics and ultimately destiny from afar. And I'd like to kick off the discussion by putting that question to Kim Holmes, who is a veteran of the George W. Bush administration, Assistant Secretary of State, and has watched up close the evolution of European policy towards the United States over the last couple of years, and also America's stance towards Europe, shifting from the Bush administration all the way up to the present. But I think there's been actually, you know, a fundamental change over the past year, obviously, not just because of what's happening in Ukraine, but because of the shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. But how do you see this question today, Kim?
Well, thank you for that question. Before I attempt to answer it, I just want to thank Slavomir Daspsky for having me and having all of us here today. It's great to see old friends up here and to see old friends all out there. This is a wonderful idea, and I just thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our ideas with you. I think I'm going to talk mostly about America. I mean, we'll have an opportunity, I'm sure, to talk about the European reaction, and I have some things to say about that. But I think to answer your question, whether or not the United States remains a European power or becomes a power in Europe with sort of an idea that we sort of offshore and we let the Europeans take the lead and the like, that is a question that's actually hangs in the balance, depending on what happens in Ukraine. The fundamental question that we now have before us, and we've talked about this, the decisions that have to be made about whether or not Ukraine will win or not, the most fundamental idea is how Americans and Europeans think about security and Russia. Are we going to continue with the sort of old idea of mutual security, that we can only have security in Europe with Russia, that is Russia's cooperation? Or are we going to do rather an attitude is that we need to deter Russia, no matter what's happening in Ukraine in the future? That's the kind of strategic concept that we still have some divisions in Europe on, particularly with the French and the Germans, to a certain extent, maybe the Austrians, Italians, and others. But the question is how have Americans looked at this question? And you could argue that America has been a European power more or less since 1917. However, after World War I, we withdrew into isolationism. We didn't really learn the lesson of America needing to be a European power in order to preserve the global and the American peace. We learned that lesson, thankfully, after World War II, and then we became truly a European power by creating NATO and becoming directly and intimately involved in the security of Europe, to the extent that we would give Europe a nuclear guarantee that would put the risk of millions of American lives at risk. That's pretty much the maximum definition, in my opinion, of what America as a European power. That was sustained for many years. I think that Ronald Reagan more or less not only sustained it, but actually took it up to a different level when he stared down the Soviet Union during the intermediate range nuclear missile crisis. And of course, as a result of that pressure and other factors, the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. But there's a lot happened in America since Ronald Reagan. And there was, first of all, the Iraq War. And the Iraq War created this perception in some circles of America, on the left and the right, that this kind of aggressive military action against Iraq was sort of a culmination, if you will, of the Reagan doctrine, or the Reagan idea of peace through strength. And so therefore being sort of an American hawk, if you will, became problematic. It's not so much because we lost the war, we didn't lose the war, but we lost the peace, in my personal opinion. I don't really believe that, and we can talk about this later, that the Iraq War was actually a culmination of the Reagan doctrine. Reagan was much more cautious than that, than what we saw with the Iraq War. But that changed fundamentally the way many Americans look at war. That's when you started seeing on the left and the right, but particularly on the right in America, a fatigue with war, raising the question that America carries too much of a burden for global peace and security. The Europeans are not doing enough. Maybe we Americans need to take more care of our own selves rather than worried about the Europeans. And so that was one of the consequences of the Iraq War. Then Barack Obama is elected president, and he is in that mood, if you will. What did Barack Obama do? Well, he managed to make it appear as if we were continuing America as a European power, but he was also subtly at the same time, with his idea of leading from behind, deferring to the Europeans and saying, particularly the Germans and the French and the European Union, that you take the lead. We Americans will be off on the shore. We'll be there in a case of extremis or duress. But you all take the lead, but we're okay, we still love you and all of that. Well, it was trying to have it both ways, but it was raising the prospect, certainly from the point of view of the Democratic Party, that maybe America as a power in Europe, an offshore power, was an option for them. Fast forward to Donald Trump. What did Donald Trump do? Well, he broke the Reagan consensus. He introduced new ideas into what it meant to be a Republican, and also created a kind of schizophrenia inside his administration over what security policy should be. On the one hand, there were old-fashioned hawks like John Bolton, National Security Advisor, Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense, who, despite Donald Trump's rhetoric against NATO, actually increased the capacity of the United States to defend NATO. But at the same time, there were a lot of people in the administration who came from, who were there mainly through domestic politics. They were younger. They were interested in the cultural revolution, if you will, that Donald Trump potentially would represent. And so they're called many things, populists, nationalists, and the like. But it opened up this idea, as Donald Trump said, let's try new ideas. Let's think outside the box. But what that ended up doing inside the conservative movement and the Republican Party was open up ideas, not only taking down the idea of a sort of a Reagan strategic doctrine, but also drifting in some wings, if you will, of the Republican Party to the position that Barack Obama had laid out, is that maybe we should be an offshore power. Maybe we should not be taking the lead. Maybe the Europeans need to take the lead. And then I'll end on this point, because I'm sure there'll be more of it, of this discussion later on. That wing of the Republican Party has outlasted Donald Trump. It is now a firm part of the Republican Party. You see it in the criticism of the U.S. bill of $40 billion of Ukrainian aid, where some senators and some other organizations are opposing it. They're opposing it for all kinds of reasons, not enough oversight, spending money on the wrong kinds of things. But some of them are also channeling this populist idea that the bill puts America last, and they need to have a policy that puts America first. And this is the new thing on the American right that has merged over the last 5 or 6 years. And I'm sure I'll have an opportunity to say where I think it's going to go in the future, but I don't want to take up too much time in my opening statement.
No, thank you for that. But just to key off that, Rebeccah, isn't the main lesson of what's happened in Ukraine over the past couple of months that without the United States, that Europe would basically fall apart from a security perspective, that we remain the linchpin here, whether the Europeans want to acknowledge that or are comfortable with that or not, that, if we don't engage, that, basically the Russians would be in Berlin right now?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that I would even say whether we want to or not. So it's not just a matter of whether the Europeans want us or not, or whether we want to or not. I mean, I would actually even just say that the Biden administration is still not doing enough. I think that there is still an indecisiveness in the Biden administration about how strong and how forward-leading the United States should be in leading Europe in a response. And it seems like a kind of an odd thing to say when we're contributing so much money. But the Biden administration has still been often later in making decisions about what kinds of aid we are going to send. I'm waiting to see what kind of economic sanctions the Europeans want to put together, what they're willing to do. And then the Biden administration, the way I see it, is really trying to straddle essentially two blocks within the NATO alliance. You have the one block led by the Brits, Poland, other Baltic nations who really truly are committed to seeing Ukrainians secure victory. And their definition of what victory would look like is very different than the more reluctant side of the NATO bloc, the French and the Germans. And there's rumors about what they may or may not be pressuring President Zelensky to do now in terms of negotiations with the Russians. And they're much more risk averse. And I think that the United States is still trying to straddle those two, not wanting to put too much pressure, not wanting to lead, and still letting Europe decide Europe's fate, with the United States having sort of a back seat. I think it's a mistake.
But just on that point, because I've been struck at how cozy the relationship is really between the Biden administration and, say, the Germans and the French. You don't see any criticism on any level. It's really a dramatic shift. And I'm just wondering if we're actually not really seeing what's going on behind the scenes. If you have a sense of what they're telling, for example, the Germans behind the scenes who have been all over the map about how they're going to respond to the crisis in Ukraine.
I don't have any inside knowledge that I'd be willing to speak about publicly, but I do think that there is it was clear that the Trump administration, for instance, talking about the tough policies against Nord Stream 2, supportive of the 3 Cs initiative, supportive of strengthening the U.S. nuclear deterrent, which, by the way, is what underpins Article 5 in the NATO alliance. I thought that Francois's point yesterday was maybe the most important point he made. I mean, the United States' nuclear deterrent is Article 5. Maybe that's overstating it a bit, but not much. And so that's why you can see why our allies are so determined to have to be part of, to have the Finns and the Swedes, want that extra level of assurance, understandably, because of Russia's invasion. So I think that there is, the Biden administration came in and thought that they could kind of turn the keys over a little bit more to the Germans, chose not to sanction Nord Stream 2 or enforce those sanctions, and kind of let the Europeans, led really by Germany and France, kind of figure it out, and that didn't work well. And we saw where that led us. And I would also say, I'm sure we can talk more about this too, I don't want to go down too far down this path, but I still see a direct line from the precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was a NATO mission. The precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan and how disastrous that was and how confusing that was to a lot of allies, and what that communicated, not just to our allies, but what that communicated to our adversaries, and then what we saw just months later with the invasion of Ukraine on the part of Russia. So just to close out this point on my part, I would say that the United States should be much more. We've been increasing the kinds of categories of weapon systems we've been providing, increasing the speed at which we've been providing the Ukrainians. But the policy needs to come first. The policy should drive the strategy should drive the budget, and the kinds of weapon systems we provide them. And we should be providing Zelensky with the kinds of weapon systems that they can actually use to go on a true counteroffensive, not to bleed the Russian military. That is a terrible strategy. That's a protracted war that only increases the chances of the Russians doing something really foolish because they get impatient and frustrated. We really need to let the Zelensky government go on a true counteroffensive so that Putin can contrive an off-ramp for himself. He has never needed facts to support what he says. So we don't need to create a fancy off-ramp that we would say is an objective. He can lose and then turn and tell his people what his off-ramp is before he decides he wants to talk. But the United States should throw behind the Brits, the Poles, the Balts, and that U.S. leadership, rather than straddling and leading from behind U.S. leadership, I think will coalesce a much stronger Western front that's necessary to give the Ukrainians what they need.
So, Andrew, you and I both live in Germany and follow the debates there very, very closely. I think we all remember a couple of years ago, President Trump wanted to pull all of our troops out of Germany, and that obviously didn't happen in the end. But just to respond to the point that Rebeccah was making there about, which I think is very apposite in this context, is what's in it for Americans? I mean, this is something I think that doesn't get enough attention in the domestic debate in the United States or in Europe. What is the kind of baseline case for the U.S. to remain as engaged in Europe as it is today?
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you to Dr. Dembski for inviting me here and having an opportunity to speak to such a terrific audience. Let me kind of tie into what Kim has said. That the United States becomes really a European power around 1917, really from the beginning of the 20th century. Two fundamental reasons. One is the exponential growth of U.S. economic base in the 19th century going into the 20th century. That's one. Two is geography, very simply speaking. The United States is a quintessentially maritime power. It's a naval power. If you look at our Constitution, we have the Navy written into the Constitution. Congress shall maintain the Navy. I'm looking at General Broadwater. The Army will be raised, so no offense to the Army here, but in that sense, the United States has always been, beginning really in the 20th century, anchored both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. We, I think, got sidelined in a lot of the discussions post-2012. We started talking about pivots, rebalancing, you know, polishing the phrase in this or that, in that fashion. And that created both a lot of instability, I think, in Europe, because it created a sense of disengagement and the kind of offshore balancing. There's a lot of poli-sci stuff written on this. And it all looks great on paper, you know, in political science conferences, et cetera, et cetera. The reality check comes when the enemy gets a vote, and the Russians just voted when it comes to the Atlantic dimension. Second point, I mean, the United States went to war on two occasions, in 1917, then following Pearl Harbor, for one structural reason, to prevent one power from dominating Europe and Eurasia, because that would have locked us into our own hemisphere and would have created a truly existential threat to the United States. There's a commercial argument here as well. You know, we're both in Europe. About 75% of commerce that comes in and out of Europe goes through the Atlantic. That commerce, globalization, all of that is possible because the United States Navy continues to protect and patrol the sea lanes of communication so that the transports can go back and forth. What we're seeing, I think, right now is the realization that this is not an either-or proposition. This is together with. Being in the Atlantic, being in the Pacific, we're both a European power and an Asian power. The kind of incredibly important moment that we're in, and I wrote about this the other day, that this happens once in 4 or 5 generations. Because of political decisions, because of Putin's decision to invade, all of a sudden, you're beginning to see not the talked about, but the real distribution of power worldwide. And you discover that the Europeans depend on America, even deferring to what Francois said yesterday during our dinner, that Europe is going to rearm. Remember, Europe has effectively disarmed over the last 30 years. With very few exceptions, if you look at the level of equipment, of munition stocks, if you look at the capability to operate, deployability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And remember that the US has an Army 2035 program, which is supposed to make us cross-domain joint force interoperable and capable to fight a near-peer adversary. The Europeans have been doing none of this. So even if they move now, we're talking about years before the European militaries will be capable of actually providing that deterrent component, which means this makes the US presence in Europe that much more important, especially in this bridging period. I'll stop here for now.
Theresa, I want to come to you on this point, and as Andrew mentioned, Francois kind of raised this last night, and it was a very interesting point, I thought, because there is this sense in Europe still that at some point down the road, the Europeans will be able to hand the keys, or rather the Americans will be able to hand the keys, as he said, to the Europeans and say, you deal with Russia, we're going to go over here and concentrate on Asia, and particularly the threat from China. Andrew, you seem to be kind of saying, well, this is not an either-or situation. Are we talking about two theaters here, Theresa, or is this really just one big theater?
Okay, first of all, I want to thank everybody for the kind invitation, the Polish Institute of International Affairs and Dr. Dembski for inviting me. It's wonderful to be back in Warsaw. I read so much about what the Poles have been doing, but just walking around the city yesterday, hearing Ukrainian, hearing Russian, seeing signs, welcoming them at assistance centers just a few meters away from this hotel. So I'm just really touched and moved by being here in Warsaw. Just to pick up, it's so hard to follow Andrew because I talk to him on the phone all the time, so it's really, I thought I was going to be the second speaker, so I just want to start with this quote in regard to the provocative question in the title of the panel, "Liberty is nothing without a pole. His presence here is essential. The illumination, the rockets, and the racket are impossible without him." This was said by Colonel Michael Jackson, 8th Massachusetts Regiment, Continental Army, 1783. So our relations have gone back quite a long time, and I'm in complete agreement with Kim and Andrew about World War I and how the US, I think they fleshed that out really well. This idea of, what I want to say here is that I have lived in Europe longer than I've lived in the US. I was born in the US. My father is from Ireland, so I really have a transatlantic approach. And I decided to study in Europe because I really believed in the European project. And the country I chose to study in, the UK, has left the EU, so they're not so rosy about it. But I have matured and grown, and I'm maybe not as idealistic, but I think it's a very important project. And we're seeing how important transatlantic relations are in regard to the EU and NATO. I have lived in Brussels now for close to 20 years, and there are two major institutions there, NATO and the EU, and in the past they barely spoke to each other. Now they have over 60 groups, various discussions, various information meetings that they get together on. I think this is a huge watershed moment. And on the earlier panel, they mentioned about convergence, how there's growing convergence between NATO and the EU, and I think this is a very positive trend. Why is this so? I mean, obviously the US isn't part of the EU, but since they are in NATO, they actually can communicate more closely. And especially with Sweden and Finland possibly joining NATO, we're having more EU member states in NATO. And there are certain things that NATO can't do, especially on the economic end. So I think the EU and NATO can work together in tandem. I think that this is a great evolution and very, very important to remember. Radoslav Sikorsky once observed that an alliance with the US is like marrying a hippo. At first it's warm and cuddly, then the hippo turns, crushes you, and doesn't even notice. So if you've lived in Europe for a little while, you might notice that there's some levels of anti-American sentiment. I live in Brussels, and I always tell everyone I'm Irish just to have a nice, quiet life. So, and it's true, I have an Irish passport, I'm not, it's not a white lie. But I think that what happened with Ukraine, it has galvanized the sentiment that NATO is really needed. And that this idea of strategic autonomy, autonomy from what has been one of the questions, and the biggest believer in strategic autonomy is Xi Jinping. He gets on the phone to Macron and Scholz and keeps reminding them, you want to be, remember that strategic autonomy narrative. So for the EU, for China, coming back to your question about the bigger geopolitical picture here, all that China wants Europe is to be neutral. it doesn't like to see a strengthened transatlantic alliance. And that's what we've seen during this Russia invasion of Ukraine. And I think that one of the biggest takeaways from this is that it's not regional security, it's global security. Every meeting in Asia, ARF, wherever there's a Russian diplomat, Ukraine is brought up. So it's not just in Europe. People are talking about it in Asia. Of course, people in Taiwan are looking closely at how the international community is responding, and this has an effect on how they interpret. And I think it has infused them with even more spirit, because how the Ukrainians are standing up to this major power. And so I think that this has had a knock-on effect in Taiwan, that we really can do more. So I think that this entente between Russia and China, yesterday's marvelous speech by Francois, there was one major thing that I found that was missing. I'm going to put this away. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by it. I have all these notes. I always want to say so much. But I think the key thing here is that the biggest change on the geopolitical spectrum that no one has talked about last night is this entente between Russia and China. With the February 4th announcement right before the Olympics between Putin and Xi, they made it quite clear. You know, they put it in writing. We know Russia is not happy about NATO, but China has made it quite clear that they're not happy with NATO. And so Xi Jinping just recently floated his idea of the GTI, the Global GSI, Global Security Initiative. And one of the countries he asked to invite in was Germany. So this is kind of a parallel universe that's going on. China's trying to step up even security cooperation. So it's not a regional issue. It's not two separate theaters. We have to think of security as global. And I think that that's so important to remember. We've already seen Russia and China do naval exercises in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Baltic Sea, also do naval exercises together with Iran. So I think that we have to think longer term. We have to think of the bigger strategic picture and not this division of labor that you worry about Asia Pacific, US, and we'll take care of Europe. Europe has to pay attention to both theaters. And I think that one of the best things, 20 years, it was the first time in 20 years Germany sent one ship, the Bayern, to the South China Sea. It was harassed there in international waters by the Chinese PLA Navy. And I think that probably sent the most important message. They can be told lots of things, but when they experience it themselves, I think it was a huge wake-up call. Let's hope that it will continue. Thanks.
So Andrew, I think you want to comment on the Russia-China dynamic, but maybe you could also just touch on the question of where we're seeing China in Europe. There's been a lot written about their investments in southeastern Europe, for example, places like Serbia, Montenegro. They own the port of Piraeus in Athens and so forth. This seems to have been still, even though it's been going on for years, kind of under the radar in the European discussion.
Yeah, on Theresa's point about the alliance between the Chinese and the Russians, this is absolutely critical because, in effect, they have created a two-front crisis for the United States and Western democracies in general, one in the Indo-Pacific over Taiwan, the other one here in Ukraine. So I have an ongoing argument with several of my colleagues who are the pro-pivot kind of cohort who say that we should not be distracted by Europe but should be going to Asia. And my argument to them is that, in fact, what is happening now with the kind of staunch resistance that the Ukrainians have demonstrated and the extent to which the Russian military is being degraded in the process, this actually begins to unravel that dual frontline dilemma because it degrades Russian power and makes it impossible going forward should something happen in the Indo-Pacific for Putin or whoever succeeds him trying to blackmail the Europeans or worse. So this is a very important part of how pivotal the war in Ukraine really is, how much it is changing internationally in terms of power distribution. China is in Europe, and China is buying up infrastructure. China is buying up assets. You know, it's not just KUKA Robotics, where you have German engineers, working now for the People's Liberation Army and so forth. It's present. People's Liberation Army Navy is coming into Europe. So this is something that we have to factor in here. I am very concerned what it means for military mobility across the continent, the ability to reinforce access to ports, access to infrastructure, what the Chinese are trying to accomplish here. I also am concerned about continued technology transfer as it gets harder for the Chinese to access our R&D base, to steal or buy or extort or whatever. Just a few years ago, Congressional Research Service put out a study that 1 in 5 Western companies, especially American companies, doing business with the Chinese or in China, has been extorted for intellectual property in exchange for market access. And when I talk to business people, they say, well, you know, it's just the way it is. It's the cost of doing business. So that needs to stop. We need hard decoupling from China on the US side and on the European side, especially in critical strategic supply chains. We should not be training their weapons designers in American STEM programs at the graduate level in the US. We've allowed for that for too long. And I am not that convinced that the Chinese will be able to compete effectively once they no longer have access to our R&D. So these are crucial decisions where we need American and European agreement, because if we are leveraged against one another, the Chinese will continue to establish their presence in Europe going forward.
Rebeccah, and then I'll come to you, Kim. But I think an important point here in all of this, if we accept that, okay, yes, the United States should remain as engaged in Europe as it is now, I think one of the lessons, though, of the Trump presidency was that Europe actually should be carrying more of its weight. Theresa was talking about the frigate that the Germans sent to the South China Sea. Well, that's nice, but that took them about 2 years or more to decide to do that. And they're now, tying themselves in knots over about whether they can send decommissioned armored personnel carriers to Ukraine. Given this lopsidedness of the United States' support for NATO, how sustainable is that in a domestic American political context? Because it seems just like a massive target for people like Trump and others to just come and shoot at. And we're seeing that now at the moment, right?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated answer to the question. I mean, I would say, to Kim's point, by the end of the Trump administration's term, NATO was stronger militarily and was making a lot of commitments that they previously hadn't made. Of course, the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine helped kind of alert some Europeans to start spending more on their own defense. But I mean, Secretary Mattis came back from one of the NATO conferences and said it was one of his most successful conferences he had ever been in with the NATO alliance because of how many commitments there were to the alliance to strengthen the alliance. A weak NATO is bad for the United States. A strong NATO with strong sovereign allies who care about their own national identities, their own sovereignty and their own borders and their own security is good for the NATO alliance. And so I think a lot of what the Trump administration did was reassert that message. That is not mutually exclusive with US leadership of NATO and Europe. And I think it's important that, for the United States, totally agree that this is a PRC Russia problem. The decision to invade Ukraine happened in Beijing at the end of the Olympics. And that was the deal that the PRC and the Russians made was on energy and it was on agriculture. And that's something else that we need to understand. What's happening with Ukraine is the Russians have the ability to weaponize the global food supply chain. With wheat coming out of Ukraine, that's why it's vital that Zelensky is able to break that blockade. Absolutely vital. I think Corey Shockey made that point in the last panel. But between those two countries together, they can weaponize global energy and agriculture and food. And so this is why if you do believe that the Chinese actually pose the greatest potential of doing the greatest damage to the U.S. security, U.S. alliance architectures, and the American way of life, if you do believe that, it is also true that the PRC has backed Russia in all of these ways, specifically in its invasion of Ukraine, conducting military drills together. The PRC has provided diplomatic backing to the Russians when the Russians violate arms control treaties. The Russians have agreed with the PRC argument about Taiwan. So they're lending each other support diplomatically, globally, in all these different ways. And so this is taking care of making sure that we stave off problems that could be coming with the PRC in Taiwan, it is critical that the United States provide Zelensky, again, I'm going to say this, and I can get into specifics about what I think that means in terms of categories of weapon systems, but the administration is still too risk averse in the kinds of categories of weapon systems that we are providing the Ukrainians. And Zelensky has been specific about the kinds of things he wants: Reaper drones, Predators, smart mines, and other kinds of things that are actually going to help them go on a true counteroffensive that the administration is still concerned would be too escalatory. We're negotiating with ourselves. We need to let that be a problem that the Russians determine what is escalatory in their own minds.
But on the Chinese point, and I don't know if this is a factor in the United States' calculation here, but China also hasn't gotten involved in the way that some people feared in supporting Russia. They've been very, very reluctant, in fact, to do so. No?
Well, it's a dynamic environment, and I think that it's in the U.S. interest to continue to make sure that the PRC calculates that would be a bad thing for them to do. I think the longer the war drones on, those calculations can change. And so that's why it's in our interest to make sure that this ends sooner rather than later. I think that the rhetoric coming out of some senior officials of settling into a long, protracted war is setting ourselves up for disaster ahead.
But the last question on this, do you think that part of the calculus might be that if the United States were to supply the kind of weapons that you're talking about, that could bring the Chinese in a more fundamental way?
I don't think that's the concern. I think that the concern is that the Russians would then determine that this is too escalatory, or the United States is a co-belligerent, or some other thing that the Russians would determine. The Russians are going to determine what they believe is in the interests of the Russian Federation. The Russians do not want a direct head-to-head military confrontation with the United States of America and the NATO alliance. We don't want it, NATO doesn't want it, Putin doesn't want it. So I think that we should be communicating what would bring about the specific thing that he does not want. And so, we're so afraid of what we might do to create escalation when it's the Russians that have invaded a sovereign nation. And we are still reluctant to provide the same kinds of military capabilities to the defensive country fighting a just war to defend their own national sovereignty. And so I think that the kinds of weapon systems we need to provide, you set the policy and the strategic objective, what is the theory of victory, and then you provide the weapon systems. You don't use tough rhetoric without providing the weapon systems to back it up. I said in a recent piece, we're poking the bear, but we're not loaded for bear. If you're going to poke the bear, you better be loaded for bear. And so we need to make sure that Zelensky is loaded for bear.
So, Kim, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. We're talking about a lot of money here from the United States Treasury already. The discussion now is this $40 billion, the land lease, which is probably going to go through. Even if you accept that, this is all China is wrapped up into this in some way, and that we need to confront both the Russians and the Chinese in Europe. What can the United States do in Europe to avoid this, what Trump called a free rider problem? This sense that it's only the United States at the end of the day that's really kind of bearing the brunt of defending Europe.
Well, we often talk about what the Germans call the Zeitenwende. In other words, have the Europeans, or some of the Europeans, truly made a turn in understanding what they must do to win this war and to have a new security order for Europe. But we must remember that it was not just Germany or France that had to make this change. It was also, as Rebeccah said, it was the Biden administration that had to make this change. They were not only sending out signals very early on that probably misled Putin into thinking that he could get away with this, and there was the Afghanistan fiasco and all of that. The good news is that they switched, and they ostensibly have made the turn. But have they made the turn when the going really gets tough? What happens if Putin starts losing really badly and he starts to sue for peace? He calls Macron and Schultz up and said, okay, put something together and let's talk to the Americans, and will allow him to still occupy some territories in eastern Ukraine. What happens to the Biden administration then when they're put on that spot, given where they were originally? I honestly don't know where they would end up, but I do know that if they take that bait and don't see the course that they're on for now, to the very end, as Rebeccah and others are talking about, then you will have a backlash in the United States, possibly from the Republican Party, that, well, we'll go back to the way it was before. The Europeans are thinking that maybe we can have some kind of a French, German, Russian condominium over Europe alongside of NATO that exists at the same time. That is what we had before, and that was what was toxic to the American political debate for supporting Europe. So it is absolutely vital that the Biden administration continue the course that it has chosen. And I think if it does that, then the Republican Party is not going to have that much of a problem. I think that even right now, even though there is opposition to the 40 million Ukrainian bill, the $40 billion aid for Ukraine, even though there's opposition to it, it's still going to go through in some fashion. Victory always, or the pursuit of a clear victory, will always have supporters. It's when you have ambivalence and confusion that politics can get off the rails. And I think that in the end, even though some people worry about the midterm elections, what happens if the Republicans that are opposing the $40 billion bill are suddenly in charge of the Congress, what does that mean for aid? I don't worry about that too much because so long as the Biden administration in the United States continues on its course for aiding Ukraine to victory. But if they pull back on that, then all bets are off.
Can I say one more thing on that aid bill too? You know, about half of that of the $40 billion. This is why I keep, trying to tell people you can't just look at the amount of money that the United States is spending and saying, look, we're doing enough. You have to look and see what the money is actually being spent on. About half of it was contributing to the war effort, restocking U.S. stocks, and getting Ukraine the weapons that they need. The other part of it was aid. And I would just say, I think that's a big part of the necessary of making sure that the Ukrainians can outlast this Russian invasion. But this is a perfect thing for the Europeans to contribute to, is the economic part of what the Ukrainians need. And Poland is doing its part, if I can say that very clearly. And I think it's incredibly important that the Western Europeans support all of the refugee work that Poland has been leading the way on. It is unbelievable what Poland has done to step up to help the Ukrainian people. It's inspiring. It is part of what has I think, galvanized so many people to see that the free world is good. We would like to see it last. It's worth defending and protecting. It's the best of us. And so this is something that if there's great reluctance and there's in fact just real practical problems and challenges with Europe, especially Germany, getting back on its feet and actually contributing more to the defense aspect, they can provide economic help, and they must. And so it's my hope that the United States is providing private but constant diplomatic pressure on those Europeans to do their part economically.
Can I just add one thing? And part of that is that you have to make it very clear that Ukraine is going to be allowed into European Union, because the European Union will be the institution to provide that kind of aid, in addition to whatever they may be doing nationally. And also, I think we should be making it clear, at some point we're going to consider Ukraine in NATO. I mean, what we're seeing by giving the Ukrainians—
I think we've already done that, but it just never—
Sorry?
I think we've already been down that road.
Well, I'm not so sure. But they've already shown that when we give them the weapons, we do the training, they've shown themselves to be a military asset to Europe. That debate should be over with.
And I also hope it is, but it raises, I think, a very important fundamental point here, also what you said, Rebeccah, about Poland and everything that Poland has done to support Ukraine, as have a number of other European countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, I would argue, if you look at what the Baltic states have done as a percentage of their GDP. And this is sort of a reminder of what Donald Rumsfeld famously called the difference between the old Europe and the new Europe. Theresa, are we seeing this divide again here? Earlier this week, you know, we saw, and last week, in fact, we saw a little bit of softening in the position by the French, Italians, and Germans about a ceasefire, and you know, sort of making soft overtures towards Putin about, well, you know, you should do a ceasefire now, and what the conditions of that might be. It was sort of very, very vague. As we heard from Prime Minister Morawiecki this morning, there is no doubt about Poland's position on these questions. Is this kind of a return to the old Europe, new Europe divide?
Well, I think that originally Russia wanted a very short war, but the way, or operation, but since this will be long and drawn out, I think we're going to see more divisions in Europe. We're starting to see the little cracks that you pointed out. And as you said, the EU should take in Ukraine. I think that's a really nice thing to say, but I'm sitting in Brussels and it's a division. I understand Central Eastern Europeans' feelings about Ukraine, and sympathy and empathy is in all European member states, but I think the reality is they're not going to join the EU. And I think that we have to not give them
do you mean anytime soon or ever?
I don't think so. Because
you don't think
I would love to see them join the EU, but if I want to be frank here, and I think it's dangerous to tell a country, I mean, even Macron came out and said, we'll come up with like a parallel structure. Why? I think it's because it's too big.
It's because of agriculture.
They have like 44 million people, and a Poland-Ukraine poll inside the European Parliament would completely change the political makeup. And so the Franco-German engine wouldn't be really happy with that, and that would really change the politics of the whole union. So I think, I'm sorry, I don't agree with it, but I think we have to point out something that we already see in opposition to from the big member states. So Ursula von der Leyen, when she went to Ukraine, she saw what happened in Bucha, and she came back and she's like, we really have to do much more. But I think if maybe Central Eastern European countries can put more pressure and get Ukraine in, I would be happy to see that. But I think we have to be a little more realistic about many of the EU member states' position on that. Excuse me. But I think that when push comes to shove, I'm concerned. I think there's a lot of disillusionment with French and German leadership, or lack of leadership, in regard to the Ukraine crisis. I call it the Schultz shuffle. I'm sorry, I'm not a diplomat. I can say what I think as I'm at a think tank. So it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And you know, he's promising something and then he changes, and he's kind of hoping the war will end so that he doesn't have to really deliver anything and keep everybody happy. So if this is long and protracted, which I think it might be, it's hard to make any sort of judgments on this or what's in Putin's head, but I think we will see more cracks, and this is a danger, and this benefits China without doing a thing, right? They can just sit back and watch the show. And I think that we'll see a much more diminished Russia. It's a pariah state. Their economy is shattered and destroyed. What is that going to mean for the future of Europe? They are not just a junior partner. They're like almost a vassal state now to China. China will have huge opportunities to buy a lot of the projects that foreign companies have left behind in Russia. And what does this mean for the Arctic? I mean, this is a key strategic area that we should be thinking about. And Russia, diminished Russia, will China be able to do more in that region, because Russia will be unable to say no to China. So China's a clear winner in all of this. The other issue is about Central Asia. China really wants to have more sway there, and a weakened Russia, it will be difficult to push back against China's growing interest in that region as well. So I think we've seen profound geopolitical changes, which we are just beginning to understand the ripple effects of what's happening in Ukraine, and it's not done. It's not over yet. And just to pick up an earlier point, why China is very afraid of secondary sanctions. So they aren't sending MREs or drones to Russia, but there are ways they can maybe do things under the table. But I think they are very fearful of secondary sanctions, so that's kind of keeping them out of it. And they are also very reliant on European and US markets, so they have to almost talk out of both sides of their mouth, tell Europeans one thing, and then when you look at the internet in China, there's a very different message that's being sent there. I read that in China Daily, they have a hashtag, and you can only do this in China. It has 1 billion likes. It's about NATO owes a blood debt to China. This goes back to the issue of the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia. So they have a long memory about all of this, and I don't think you get 1 billion likes anywhere else but maybe in China. So we see this magnification of Russian propaganda and disinformation in China, and that's something we should be worried about, especially in the global south. We see this is an area that we're not paying too much attention to, and China and Russia are kind of creating the narrative there. So I think we have to really see some more leadership. And I understand Central Eastern European countries' disillusionment with the Franco-German engine, and there are heated debates in Brussels saying, if we're all members of the EU, why are the French and the Germans not even driving this car anymore? So I think that there has to be a real discussion of how power is distributed. Poland is punching way above its weight. I think they have shown real leadership during this crisis. And I think that, as you mentioned, France and Germany kind of wheedling about a bit. The longer this goes on, I think it will become more evident. And I think that this is a big concern within other EU member states.
So, Andrew, you've been living in Europe for a long time, and I realize this is a tough question. This is something that the United States has been working on, arguably, since World War II. But how can the U.S. get the Franco-German motor really working on the security front here, and kind of repair this clear division on some of these questions between Central and Eastern Europe and Western, the old Western Europe?
Yeah, thanks. This is I think the core question, and I'm looking with great expectations and maybe some trepidation at what's going to come out of the next NATO summit. We both live in Germany. This is my second tour now in Germany. And this is not to make excuses for the decades of underinvestment in the Bundeswehr. These processes were budget-driven. They were not requirement-driven, and the conditions of the Bundeswehr that you have today are a result of that. But let's understand what happened when Chancellor Scholz gave his Bundestag speech, in effect disavowing 3 decades of German-Russia policy. And so you're talking about a very painful adjustment of the entire strategic culture in Germany today. The fact that President Steinmeier, who was one of the greatest proponents of Nord Stream, has admitted that he was wrong on this. The fact that you have the German government commit $100 billion to rearm, the question is, can they actually spend the money, and what will this mean in the long run? The infrastructure deficiencies that you have in Germany, during the Cold War, every bridge was rated to carry a tank with a trailer on it. Tanks are now heavier, trailers are bigger. All this neglect, access to rail, which is, I'm sure, keeping US commanders in Europe awake at night thinking of how this is supposed to work. Chinese control of different harbors and so forth. So these are all huge issues. How do we get the French and the Germans to bring NATO together and bring themselves in that structure in alignment with the larger transatlantic priorities? Here's my theory 101. I've always told my students that nations live in neighborhoods, and that neighborhood defines your security optics. And one thing that was truly evident in the 30 years of the post-Cold War era was that we had a fragmented security optics across the NATO alliance. Germany was no longer a frontier state post-1990. Poland is now what West Germany was during the Cold War. It's the key frontier state in the alliance. So when I would travel to Tallinn or Warsaw or Bucharest, it was all about Russia. When I started moving west, Germany was bidirectional. It wanted to use economic and political means rather than relying on hard security to manage Russia, if you will. The belief that this interdependence will somehow lower the Russian threat and will also have economic benefits. When I arrived in Paris, it was predominantly about the South, especially if you talk to the French military. You know, for most of the French leaders, Europe's southern border is no longer on the Med, it's in Africa, it's deep in the Sahel. And when I would get to Lisbon, I had no idea what they were interested in. It was kind of all largely irrelevant. What the attack on Ukraine has done, it's unified the threat perception to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent. It forced the reassessment. Before Scholz's speech, Germany was tracking to become probably one of the biggest losers as a result of this invasion. This fundamental reorientation, and we will see what follows in terms of policy. You know, this is very important. But this has changed the internal dynamic. The key question, in my view, will be what the end point in this current war in Ukraine is going to look like. I think that there's absolutely zero appetite in Kiev for any compromise in place. You know, Zelensky is very Churchillian right now. He is the leader. The minute he agrees to a compromise that surrenders more Ukrainian territory, I think he loses that position. U.S. leadership, and I think, quite frankly, U.S. pressure on our key allies in Europe will be absolutely essential in aligning this larger security optics in Europe, because during the Cold War, whether you're in Germany or France or elsewhere, your risk in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion was broadly shared. And we are now on a cusp of rediscovering that sense of the shared threat. But there are still elements, I think the farther you are away from the frontier, of trying to go to, maybe not the way things used to be, but trying to diffuse the crisis, to get to a compromise. And the default position used to be in Europe that if there was fighting, if there was a conflict, the priority was not to defeat the aggressor, but the priority was to stop the fighting and then work that compromise beyond it. The Ukrainians have shown us that actually that's not how you're supposed to operate, that if your territory is attacked, you defend that territory. Assumptions about Ukrainian staying power, I think, is what has fundamentally changed the whole balance in European security debate. Last but not least, what Theresa said about the importance of Poland. I was recently at Tartu at the Baltic Defense College conference, and President Ilves, former president of Estonia, opening up a panel, said, turning to some of the old Europeans on the panel, said, yeah, for years you were calling us Russophobes, you know, those unreconstructed East Europeans. Who was right? And there was this long silence, and then an old European said, well, but we need to negotiate a way out of that conflict. I think this is where the fault line lies, how closely we can bring the optics of the countries on the flank and the countries that are farther to the west.
Yeah, Theresa.
Can I just chime in here really quickly? The Germans have that saying, Wandel der Handel, change through trade. And that was part of their Ostpolitik with Russia. We saw this huge energy dependence. And I remember back in the 80s when they built the Druzhba oil pipeline, the US government kind of said, maybe it's a good idea to only be about 25% dependent on Soviet energy. And at the time, they were about 30%. So they're in this 25 to 30% band. Today, it's 58% dependent. So I don't care if your neighbor is Canada, they're nice folks, but you'd never want to be dependent for something 58%. So this idea of energy diversification I find really shocking. And when I was based in Moscow and we were looking at all the, back then, the new accession states, they had such a high dependency on Russian energy. And I would interview people at the commission and say, how come this wasn't part of the acquis? Why wasn't this kind of pointed out to become a new member, to actually diversify a bit? And I mean, these member states had 96, 100% dependency, and no one flagged it. No one thought it was an important issue. And I think that type of attitude kind of filtered in. So you had Merkel for 16 years, she was from Eastern Germany, and you saw this increase in energy dependence. So I think that there is a very important lesson to learn here, and it's, just energy. The same phrase, Wandel durch Handel, is used for trade with China. So the more you trade with China, the more they're going to be like us, and we can hug them, and everything will be jolly. Well, it's turned out the other way. China has changed the US and Europe more than we have changed China. So I think that the lack of appetite in response to sanctions, real sanctions with teeth, because we all know, putting a sanction on Russian caviar when actually China exports more caviar to Europe, that doesn't really bite. So I think we all know what needs to be done. €1 billion a day is paid to Moscow for energy across the entire EU, and no one has the appetite to do that. God forbid there is anything to happen with China, and sanctions would be expected. I see very little appetite for that. So I think Beijing is watching very closely how Europe is responding, and this is kind of a test for perhaps how they will respond if China decides to do something with Taiwan. So I think we really have to pay attention, and the message that Europe sends to the rest of the world is being monitored by everyone.
Can I say something about the Germans?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you something about the Germans, so I'll ask a question, then you can say what you're doing before I forget the question. You mentioned the Zeitenwende, which, Andrew, you also alluded to, this kind of sea change in German policy and supposedly 100 billion euros. A couple of years ago, another security conference, less known, based out of Munich, put out a report also called the Zeitenwende. And if you look at it, it's quite interesting, because at the time they weren't talking about this scenario. For them, the Zeitenwende was that the United States is basically going to divorce itself from Europe and strategic autonomy, and Europe needed to be prepared to kind of stand on its own two feet and so forth. There's still fears about that in Europe, and I think one thing that we haven't really discussed here that is important, I think, when addressing the question of the United States in Europe, is what happens if Donald Trump wins the next election in the United States, or maybe another Republican. I know some of us don't think he would win or run necessarily, but should there be another Republican with his views, what would that mean for the alliance? I'm asking that to you, Kim, and then you can tell us where you want to go.
I want to talk about Germany, not Trump. Thank you. Well, I'll try both, if you don't give me a second. What I wanted to say about the Germans is that the change that they're having to make is a lot more than just getting off dependent upon Russian energy. They have built up over decades, and the Germans are conceptual people. They practically invented Western philosophy. And so when they do something, they do it seriously at the idea level. So you have an entire generation of German intellectuals, German politicians, institutions that have rationalized and invested their intellectual firepower into justifying what it is now has been proven wrong. That is not easy for them. They're a very proud people, as we know. That's not easy for them to make that change. So they're having to change more than just the structure of their economy. They're having to change the way they think. Andrew and I were talking early on, with the long course of German history, what seems to be going on here? There is a lot of German history, as we well know, but in some cases we misunderstand where Germany wants to be based upon what happened in World War II or even in World War I. The long pull of German history is fundamentally, at least since unification, is Bismarckian. They have always seen that security of Germany was some way wrapped up with Russia. That is a concept that Germans have a very hard time conceptually even imagining something different. So what I would ask all of you in this room, particularly people in Poland, is realize that there is a debate inside Germany on this among the intellectuals, among the political class. There is some question about this, all the concepts about Russian guilt versus Polish and Ukrainian guilt, all this stuff is happening. You two live in Germany, you see it. Make a separation between what Scholz is doing in your mind and what could possibly be happening in the German political culture. Reach out to these Germans, listen to their debates, bring them to your conferences, and have a discussion with them. At first, I mean, a friend of mine and I are trying to get an article published in a German newspaper making this appeal to the Germans, and nobody will touch it because they don't want to be lectured by Americans. I understand that. And they don't want to come here in Poland and be lectured by Poles either. Let's face it.
Send it to Politico.
What's that?
You can send it to Politico.
Yeah, right. Well, so I just think that there is a possibility here that we can reach out to I think the German public would actually be more supportive of the change, of the turn, if they had a government and a leadership that supported it wholeheartedly. Now, you asked about Donald Trump. I don't know what's going to happen in the elections. I don't even know in the midterm elections what's going to happen. It's just too early to say. So you're asking me a very hypothetical question. What happens if you had someone like that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's hypothetical, but there's a good chance, given the way things are going for Biden, that he wouldn't win the next election. We'll have another Republican president.
I think that would not. I think you would still have the divisions that you saw during the Trump presidency. You would still have a strong contingency in the GOP and the Republican national security structure that would still support a strong support for Europe. But you would also have this undertow of these people in the populist wing of the party who, by the way, look at foreign policy not as a foreign policy issue, but as a stand-in and a symbolism for the culture wars. Where, from their point of view, Russia and Ukraine are caught up in the American political war over, does Russia belong to Trump or does Ukraine belong to Biden? Because of the impeachment crisis. And some of these people that are now in the Republican Party that are pontificating on the war are really motivated by that. They're motivated by domestic politics. They're motivated by signaling where you stand inside the United States on the culture wars. And so Russia and Ukraine is being caught up in that. We're all sort of experts here, and we talk about it as a foreign policy abstraction, but that's not what's really happening in that particular wing of the party. But we had that before with Donald Trump, and you would have something like that before. The real question is, and I don't have an answer to this, is what happens if that wing is the dominant wing in the Congress? It's not now.
Rebeccah, I want to come to you on that, and then I had a last question for you.
Sure. I mean, I don't really have much more to add except to say, in all polling, every time the American people are polled, Ukraine has broad bipartisan support across the country. In fact, Republicans poll higher than Democrats do on the point of the United States needing to be tougher on Russia than what this administration has been. And you can parse it out and explain what it is that they want: energy independence. They want all sorts of things to make it more difficult on the Russians to have so much coercive leverage over the United States and the West. And Zelensky is very popular among Americans just across the country. And so again, I also think it's too soon to know how that will impact any particular politician's view on things, because politicians want to be popular and well-liked, and that is a consensus issue right now across the country. And I'll just give a little anecdote. I'm from Ohio, this little town in Ohio, and I asked my dad, I was checking with my folks just to make sure that I'm not inside my own bubble, inside the Washington, D.C. swamp, and don't really know what's going on in the real part of the country. And I asked him, and I said, who are you going to vote for in the Ohio elections he just had? And he said, I'm going to write in Zelensky. And so I mean, he is very, very popular. Americans appreciate. Donald Trump's message over 4 years was, you need to care more about, and this is what Secretary Mattis said to the Europeans, you need to care more about your people than Americans care about your people. Ukraine is doing that. Ukraine is not just fighting for these abstract concepts of democracy. They're fighting for freedom, for their families, for their country, for their sovereignty, for their country. And that's exactly what the United States has asked of our allies. And when they do that, you reward them. And then you cultivate that among our allies and partners. So I'm not as worried. I still think there's going to be broad bipartisan consensus. I might continue to criticize the extent that we provide aid and provide support, but I do think that is going to continue. And then if I want, just before we close out, I do want to talk more about this concept of unintended escalation and why I think that's been a problem for the United States.
Yeah, I want to come to that. We have a couple minutes left. We had some virtual questions that I want to get to, but maybe we do a quick round. We have Finland and Sweden joining NATO hopefully soon. How does that change the calculus, Andrew, especially with an eye towards the Arctic?
Well, it completely reconfigures the geostrategic depth and space. You know, we used to talk about the Baltic states as being exposed, essentially indefensible. The RAND study that was put out there several years ago that it has to be a liberation strategy, blah, blah, blah. This changes everything. All of a sudden, you've got a larger Scandinavian Baltic space that touches the European North and opens up a completely different map in terms of operational planning and the rest of it. So I find this decision to be both a fundamental recognition in Stockholm and in Helsinki that you cannot just be a partner. Being a partner does not deter. I mean, this is a very clear message. There's this meme that's now all over the internet, that Stoltenberg is giving Putin the award of the best NATO salesman in the world. You probably have seen that. But in effect, that's what he accomplished. He forced the debate. I've done some work in Finland, and seeing the realignment of the, especially Finnish leadership on this was absolutely crucial. Because of how the political dynamic works. So that's a huge change. I think what's going to be even more important is putting real exercised capabilities on the ground by our European allies. There's no substitute for that. And I think we have got ourselves so wrapped up around those percentages so that, if your procurement is only budget driven, and that has been the case with the Bundeswehr, for example, then you end up in a situation that you're in. I mean, after that report from the Munich Security Conference, I remember sitting in a discussion where German military were talking about the 5th generation acquisition program. Remember, at that time, the F-35 was not even to be included in the competition. Look at the sea change right now. Look at the willingness to actually go into the U.S. market to buy systems for Germany, whether it's heavy helicopters or other things. That is a sea change because it moves completely away of all this PESCO car, European Defense Fund conversation.
We only have 3 minutes left. I've got one final question for the three of you from a viewer here, and you can get into the escalation point, Rebeccah, but when will Russia be defeated? This is an easy question to answer. Got 1 minute. You want to take that?
Okay.
And I think when, what has to happen for us to sort of say?
Just pick up a quick point. Your active said, is Putin a CIA agent? Because he's been doing things so badly. Well, the life expectancy in Russia is now 71 years old, and Putin will be having his birthday soon. So maybe Mother Nature might take care of things. Well, I think Russia, the question again?
When will it be defeated? When will, what would basically constitute a victory?
I mean, anything they want to say is a victory, because I think they're going to try to spin it as much as they can. And unfortunately, they are destroying the economic base of Ukraine. And, if they can't have it, no one else can. And we're seeing Mariupol, for example, being bombed back to the Stone Age. I mean, Warsaw is like a phoenix. That 90% of Warsaw was destroyed, and it grew out of the ashes. But it's going to be a big, big problem, I think, for Ukraine. We're seeing already world inflation, food insecurity. Putin wants to control the entire coast, make Ukraine landlocked. So I think unless, there was an interesting trial balloon that went up with the German general suggesting live on television that maybe this wasn't the best move, which I think, made all the analysts kind of wonder what's going on there. I'm afraid that Putin will just stick to his plan, just like Xi Jinping is sticking to his plan. He's not kind of moving away from Putin at all. And I just want to end on a positive note, because in Brussels we're always told we have to end on a happy note, and I feel I've been kind of negative. So the new Czech presidency is going to have a conference on the Indo-Pacific. And this is an area where the US and Europe can cooperate. And I think that this is a really key development, and the fact that this was brought in during the German presidency and it's developed even further. So I think that this is a really positive direction for both the EU and the US to focus
Okay, but we're going to end on a less positive note.
Can I give a short answer?
Quickly.
The expulsion of Russian forces from Ukraine, let the Ukrainians decide whether that includes Crimea. It must be seen clearly by all of us in the West as a defeat for Vladimir Putin and a defeat for aggression. He can spend it at home any way he wants.
Hallelujah. Rebeccah, last word.
No, I completely agree. I mean, this is going to end once the Western-backed Ukrainian forces cause Putin to decide this is no longer in his interest. And so that gets back to my point about this constant fear of escalation. It's actually the risk aversion on the part of the United States to cross this line of what they consider particular weapon systems or category weapon systems that would necessarily be escalatory is actually having the effect of giving the Russians escalation control. If you, again, you set the policy and the strategy and you give the weapon systems to carry that through. Every time the Russians threaten nuclear employment, and they do it in a variety of ways, and then you have the President of the United States or other heads in other capitals in the West saying, we don't want to risk World War III, so we're not going to do this, or we're not going to provide this. What that communicates is that there is great coercive power over threatening with nuclear weapons. That is not the message that the United States wants to be sending to China either. And so the answer to that is calm, cool, resolve. We should not normalize nuclear brinksmanship and escalation and coercion to the point that it causes the United States to not provide the kinds of aid that is necessary on entirely reasonable levels of conventional escalation. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, but what we don't want to have, again, is normalizing. The polls, again, have been so great. When you ask the Polish ambassador to the United States about the nuclear threats, he says, we're sick and tired of the Russian nuclear threats. And you can't be intimidated by them. And it means that you actually have to demonstrate credible resolve for our own deterrent and our nuclear umbrella. And then we need to engage calmly and coolly, continue to do what is necessary to, again, push the Russians out of Ukraine, not allow the Russians to continue this protracted war, because that's what normalizes other really, really bad ideas for the Russians. The longer this goes on, the more comfortable they are with things like escalate to de-escalate, or where the PRC might then become more comfortable contributing in ways they have not thus far.
On that cautionary note, we're going to end it. Thank you all for a very good discussion, I think, and I think we all look forward to lunch.